The wind tore across the barren stretch of prairie like a blade, carrying sand and cold and the echoes of a woman's sobs as Emily Rourke crawled through the dying grass, clutching her newborn twin boys against her chest, their small bodies squirming weakly beneath the threadbare blanket she had torn from her own dress because her husband, Louis, had ripped the real one from her hands before riding off and leaving her to die, shouting over his shoulder that he didn't need two new mouths to feed, and that no woman who couldn't give him sons who lived the first time deserved a second chance, a cruelty sharpened by the memory of the daughter they lost last spring, a cruelty that burned deeper than the cold biting her skin, as she pressed her lips to her babies' heads and whispered that she would not let them die out here. Not like this, not as prey for wolves or as nothing more than another body swallowed by the prairie. But even as she whispered the promise, she felt her strength buckling, felt blood loss pulling her down into a haze where sound stretched and bent like distant thunder. And for a moment she thought she truly had begun to die because a dark silhouette appeared on the horizon. Tall, mounted, moving with the silent fluidity of a predator or phantom, as if riding out of the sun itself, as she tried to shield her boys with her shaking arms because she feared it might be the men who had taken Louis in, the same men who convinced him a real settler doesn't need weak people around him. But as the rider drew nearer, she realized this was no settler, no farmer, no rancher. This was a Comanche warrior, lean and sharp-eyed, his painted horse cutting through the wind like an arrow, his braids whipping behind him, his gaze locked onto her with a strange mix of caution and shock, as if he could not believe what he was seeing, a bleeding woman alone with newborns in a stretch of land where only death usually bothered to linger. Yet instead of riding past her, or circling like a scouting hawk, he dismounted in one swift, fluid motion, dropping to the ground beside her, his presence fierce yet grounding, his hand steady as he touched the blood-soaked earth near her hip, and then her forehead as if testing whether she still lived, and she forced out a sound, something between a plea and a whimper, before collapsing against him, the twins' faint cries rising in panic. But the warrior moved faster than her fading senses could follow, pulling a wrapped hide from his saddle and cradling the newborns with surprising gentleness, then lifting her into his arms with the practiced strength of a man who had carried wounded friends in battle. And though Emily could not understand his words, the tone told her everything. He was not going to let her die. Not here, not now, not while he still drew breath, and the moment he mounted with her balanced against his chest and the twins nestled before her, she heard hoofbeats pounding behind them, distant at first, then growing, a storm of horses cresting the horizon. And terror gripped her because she thought it was a war party, thought that saving her had marked the warrior for punishment by his own people. But when she blinked through the haze, she saw only dust, only distance, and realized the approaching riders were not Comanche at all but settlers, armed, angry, and spreading out to flank, as if searching for something or someone. And she knew instantly who. Louis had told them she'd run mad or stolen, supplies or woes, because men like him always needed a lie to cover their cowardice. And the warrior stiffened, his instinct sharp, shifting his weight and turning the horse away from the direction of danger without hesitation, spurring it into a wind-tearing gallop as Emily's vision flickered and the twins wailed in chorus, their tiny cries swallowed by the rush of hooves as the warrior angled them toward the ridge where rocks and shadows might hide their escape. But the settlers saw the movement and began shouting, raising rifles, firing shots that cracked through the prairie air like snapping bones, bullets kicking up dust near the horse's legs, and Emily gasped, clutching her babies tighter, feeling tears burn her cheeks as the warrior leaned low, guiding the horse with his knees while his free hand swept behind him to grab his bow, knocking an arrow in one smooth motion and firing backward without looking, the arrow whistling past Emily's ear and striking the lead settler's rifle, sending it spinning from his hands, buying them a moment but not safety, because the settlers were not the only threat rising in the wind. Wolves had begun pacing at the edges of the plain, drawn by her scent, by the smell of blood, and the warrior's horse let out a warning snarl of breath, ears pinned back as shapes darted along the ridge, gray bodies weaving through the tall grass with predatory intent, closing in with the confidence of creatures that sensed weakness, and Emily cried out again, fear for her son shredding what little strength she had left. But the warrior kept riding, kept choosing the narrowest, most dangerous path through the rocks where neither wolves nor men could follow easily. And when he finally reached a slope steep enough to slow pursuit, he pulled the horse behind a jagged outcrop, lifting Emily into his arms again as he scanned the horizon. Settlers disappearing behind rising dust clouds. Wolves pacing below like ghosts waiting for night. The prairie stretching wide and merciless. But his expression didn't falter. If anything, it hardened into resolve. The kind of resolve that came from a code older and stronger than any law on the frontier. A code that demanded protection of the vulnerable, especially mothers with new life in their arms, and he motioned for her to stay silent as he carried her into a narrow seam in the rock wall. A natural crevice hidden unless someone already knew where to look. A place that smelled of smoke and herbs, evidence of an old Comanche hideout. And as he laid her down near a small ring of stones, he slipped away only long enough to gather water from a nearby spring, returning with a leather pouch and kneeling beside her, mixing crushed leaves with drops of water and pressing the bitter paste to her lips as the twins squirmed and whimpered. Their hunger rising like a rising tide, and Emily forced the medicine down even though it burned, even though her throat felt raw, because she sensed she needed it to stay alive long enough to nurse her boys. And when she finally managed to hold them to her chest and they latched weakly, the warrior watched with an expression she couldn't read, something between reverence and sorrow, as if he knew exactly what it meant for a mother to fight through death for her children. And though they could not speak the same tongue, he touched his chest and then hers, a silent vow that he would not leave her, not until she could stand on her own feet again. But even as the night crept in and wolves howled in the distance and the prairie grew colder, Emily sensed this was only the beginning, sensed danger still lurked beyond the firelight, because she had lived long enough with men like Lewis to understand that when cowards feared being exposed, they hunted the truth until it was dead. And she knew Lewis would come, not because he loved her or the sons he abandoned, but because he feared what she might say about him if she survived, and the warrior seemed to sense it too because he never closed his eyes fully that night. Always listening, always scanning the darkness, always ready. And when dawn broke with a knife-edge chill, the crevice filled with the thunder of hooves, not the settlers this time but Comanche warriors, dozens of them cresting the horizon in tight formation, their horses snorting clouds of breath, their faces painted for war, and Emily tensed, pulling her babies close. But the lone warrior stepped forward, raising his hand, giving a single call that echoed down the ridge and brought the entire formation to a halt, silence sweeping over the prairie like a held breath as their leader, a broad-shouldered, iron-backed man with hawk feathers braided into his hair, rode forward, studying Emily with a gaze sharp enough to cut stone, then turning that same gaze on the warrior who had saved her, exchanging words in a deep, rolling cadence that Emily could not understand but whose weight she could feel, and she knew from their tones that the young warrior had acted without permission, that he had followed his own principles, that what he had done carried meaning, consequence, danger. And yet when the Comanche leader finally dismounted and approached her, he did not lift a weapon or issue a threat. Instead, he knelt, lowering his voice, speaking softly, gently touching one of the twins' foreheads with a reverence she did not expect, then placing a protective charm of beads and bone into her hand. And she realized he was not angry. He was acknowledging her strength, acknowledging the warrior's choice, acknowledging the responsibility that now belonged to them all. Because a woman abandoned to die by her own people on Comanche land created a bond of honor that could not be ignored. And whatever happened next would shake the prairie with conflict. Because Lewis and the settlers would not stop searching, and the Comanche would not allow harm to come to a woman under their protection. And Emily, who only a day ago thought she would die alone in the date, now found herself at the center of a storm where two worlds would collide, and the only thing standing between her sons and the violence rising in the wind was a lone warrior who had chosen mercy over indifference, courage over caution, honor over silence. And she felt her heartbeat, steadying as he stepped beside her, his presence a shield against the chaos gathering on the horizon, his hand resting lightly on his knife as the first dust trail of approaching riders rose again. Lewis returning, armed and desperate, and the Comanche warriors straightened in unison, their horses shifting, their expressions sharpening, and Emily knew the fight for her son's future was far from over, knew every breath forward would test her strength, test the warrior's resolve, test whether mercy or vengeance would decide what kind of world her boys would grow into. And she inhaled deeply, lifting her chin, meeting the rising danger not as the abandoned woman on the prairie, but as a mother with something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. And as the Comanche war chief raised his spear and the lone warrior stepped ahead of the line, Emily felt the fragile beginnings of hope ignite inside her chest, small, trembling, but alive, just like the sun she held close. And as the wind carried the thunder of hoofbeats toward them once more, the prairie waited for blood or peace, for salvation or ruin, and Emily whispered to her babies that this time she would not break, that this time she would not run, that this time she would fight, because she had not been saved by accident but by a man bound to her survival by honor older than law, older than borders, older than the cruelty of one cowardly settler who thought he could decide her fate. And she pressed her sons against her heart as the Comanche and the settlers closed in, the frontier trembling beneath the weight of two worlds on the edge of collision. And the warrior who saved her gripped his spear with calm fury, ready to defend the woman he had refused to abandon even when death itself had hovered over her, and the sun rose behind them like a burning omen as the moment of reckoning drew near.